First item we have this morning is a presentation by the Lubbock Electric Utility Governance Commission that we had appointed. W.R. Collier's the chair, and I see that I think his entire committee is here this morning. So I'll turn it over to W.R. to make that presentation, and I would ask the council that while they make their presentation, if we have any questions, maybe make a list of them, let them go through their presentation, and then W.R. and the committee can take questions at the end. You want to introduce the committee for us, W.R.?
Yes, we're going to do that with a slide in a minute.
No questions.
I want to be sure that they're properly introduced, Mayor.
All right.
First of all, Mayor McDougall and members of the City Council, I want to thank you for giving us time this morning to come and have dialogue about, in my opinion, one of the greatest assets of the City of Lubbock, and that's Lubbock Power and Light. So as we go through this morning, I want to, first of all, thank my committee, and most of those people are here today, and I want to thank them for their hard work, their dedication, and the time that they invested in this project, because it's been a great experience for most of us. Now, back in 2003, actually December of that year, you appointed this group of people to do a study of Lubbock Power and Light. And we had a charge that you all gave to us and outlined what we were supposed to do. And I believe, go ahead and basically, we were to review and evaluate various issues related to the governance of LP&L. And that was probably the crux of the entire situation. Now, today, in our presentation, we have divided this presentation up into segments. And J.Q. Warnick, who is the senior member of our committee, and also the person that has served in many aspects of LP&L through the years, is going to give us a history of LP&L and talk about some other studies that have been made through the years regarding LP&L. And he is also our vice chairman of our committee. In addition to that, we're going to have John Swiker and Connie Horton to give us an overview of some of the problems that LP&L has experienced in recent times, and also some of the challenges that LP&L had to face. Now, after they make their presentation, then I will present to you the findings and suggestions of the committee for your consideration today. And then, if you would, hold your questions until we've all made our presentations, and then we'll come back up here and you can fire away at us. Okay, Judge.
Thank you. Mayor and members of the council, being the oldest member of the committee and one who has been through this business on several occasions, that's why I got called to do this. So I just want to do a little history about it, and really I'm more interested in the history of the various committees that have dealt with it. I won't be looking at the screen, so if there's some embarrassing picture of a city councilman, that's none of my doing. After Franklin flew his kite and Edison invented the light bulb, then somewhere along the way, electricity in 1909 came to Lubbock, Texas, and it wasn't very economical or very reliable. It cost 20 cents a kilowatt hour then, and that relates to $3.85 a kilowatt hour in today's dollars. And the service was unsatisfactory. The electric place used to, I think they just turned it on in the daytime. The electric place changed hands a couple of times, and finally the city council had the wisdom to think that if we're going to have reliable and reasonable electricity for our citizens, we need to have our own power plant. And the citizens of this community voted to establish that, and the plant opened on September the 28th, 1917, and immediately the electric rate was cut in half. It went from 20 cents to 10 cents, and so 86 years ago, coming now on to 87, Lubbock Power and Light began business and has steadily improved and grown and done all those things. The rates, as I said, got cut, And in the 1970s, electricity had gone down to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. In the 60s, it got clear down to 2.5 cents, and under present circumstances, it's 7 cents a kilowatt hour. I don't claim to be a great mathematician, but from the beginning rate way back there that they had, today's rate is a 5,400% decrease in the original electric rate, and from the 10 cents, it's only a 2,700% decrease. Not many businesses can make a claim like that. And so the part of the history is that it has supplied electricity at reasonable rates. It has been reliable. Everybody in town has electricity available to them from Lubbock Power and Light, except those few sections of town that the Public Utility Commission reserved to the co-op out here that we do not serve. And we have some of the lowest electric rates in the state of Texas, and the reason we have that, I think it would be fair to say, is because of the competition. And so that's where we arrive at today. But on several occasions, the City Council has called on citizens to take a look at Lubbock Power and Light and make recommendations about it. In 1969, the City Council called on the Chamber of Commerce to form a committee. I don't know how many people were on it, to go around town and have hearings and forums. And were you on it, TJ? And the object of that committee was to come up with goals for the 70s for this city. And there were a bunch of those goals, but one of those goals is of interest. And these were citizens who did it, who had no axe to grind and nothing to gain from it. And they recommended that there be an independent board for Lubbock Power and Light. I do not have the names of the folks who served on that committee. And then at that time, Lubbock Power and Light had an advisory board just like it does today. I had the privilege of being on that board, and we were just like they are today in charge of the advertising budget. We had a huge budget back then. We had $30,000 in the advertising budget. And after they had recommended that, in 1972, after the utility board unanimously endorsed that goal, I appeared before the City Council and asked them to do something about it and create that independent board. Their answer to that was to create a committee known as the Bloom-Rosen Committee. It had J.R. Bloom-Rosen, the local lawyer, as the chairman. That's the reason it had his name. It had no other name. Clarence Whiteside, who'd been a councilman and mayor here and was a successful businessman. A lot of us remember the old Whiteside Laundry. I do, where my mom always took her laundry over there on Avenue S and 20th Street. Also, Mr. E.K. Hofstadler, a successful businessman, a banker, had been a councilman also. Jack Payne, you may know him, W.R., or may have known him, and he was the founder and at that time president of the American State Bank, and Hoyt Nix, who is still in the electric supply business here. He supplies materials to people. And that committee came back and reported, and they added one word to what the goal for the 70 was, and they said what the City Council should do is create an immediate independent managerial board. Well, I hate to report to you that nothing came of that, and I was the chairman of the utility board, and we voted unanimously for me to go and urge the council to please do something about that report that they had requested. And we did. They asked us to look at it. We unanimously endorsed it and said, hey, do it. And the members of the utility board, with the exception of the chairman, were once again prominent people. Mr. Hofstadler was one. Mr. Gene Alderson, who had been a councilman here and is a local businessman. Charlie Cobb, a prominent attorney who was the school district attorney for years. John Herzer, who was manager of the Plains Co-op oil mill. Yes, sir. And Jack Powers, who was a highly respected professor out at Texas Tech. And we all endorsed the committee report, and in August appeared to urge the council to do something about it. Mr. Bloom-Rosen, who was a great advocate, was pretty angered, as I recalled at that time, and he appeared before the council, and he kind of said to him, if you weren't going to do anything about what we said, then why did you appoint us and have us waste all that time? And nothing came of that. In 1978, another committee was appointed to take a look at several factors involving LP&L, and there's a list of prominent people without reviewing them all. And one of them was a fellow some of you may know named Owen Gilbreth. He was on there, and so I called it the Gilbreth Committee, hoping it might influence someone on the council to be in our favor. That committee, however, at that time there was a movement underfoot to sell LP&L, and so that committee made a report back to the council, as Owen tells us, as he remembers it, and their major thing was not to sell LP&L, which once again endorsed what everybody else had said, that it's a great business and a great part of the city. And then the spring of 2003, the city manager appointed an oversight committee, picked 3 good men and 1 mistake again, picked Mike Liner as president of the city bank, John Wilkerson, a great businessman in our city, and Bob Matthews, a former FBI agent, and yours truly here. And as part of our report about what we were studying about the electric industry, we recommended that there be created an independent board at Lubbock Power and Light, and I suspect that this governance committee is an outgrowth of that. I hope so. But I make 2 points about this history. Every time that a city council at this city has asked citizens to get together and to study LP&L, those citizens groups have come back to you, all competent businessmen, interested citizens, dedicated to the welfare of this city and this city government, and every time they have come back to a city council and said, create an independent board. I would simply say this and answer to anybody who says not do it. If it was a good idea 32 years ago, members of the council, and by golly, it's a good idea today, and there isn't any sense in waiting beyond today and waiting another 32 years to do what ought to be done.
He never will tell us how he feels, you know it.
No, sir.
Thank you, Judge. Mayor and members of the City Council, John Zwiker and I would like to spend a few minutes talking to you. We'd sort of, if the judge talked about what's happened in the past, we'd like to move it forward just a little bit and talk about maybe in the last 3 to 5 years, try and summarize for you what we think have been some of the issues. We're going to divide this into 2 pieces, and I'm going to cover a couple of pieces, and John is going to cover the last of it. You know, if we look at the last, say, 3 to 5 years with LP&L, as this group got together and we studied the history and we looked at the recent issues, we came to some conclusions, and one of those is that, you know, we truly believe that LP&L has been acting without proper oversight from the City Council and the City Manager's office. And we think that that's a situation that needs to be remedied. You know, one of the questions that's been asked is, well, you know, what is going to be different in the future with what you're proposing as to what there is right now? And I would just make a comment that the current advisory board committee panel is just that. It is an advisory board. And as such, there are not, you know, definite lines of governance. There are not specific accountabilities. And so while, you know, I think the board is very capable, it does not have specific accountabilities from LP&L, and we believe that that's something that needs to be remedied. So that's one set of issues. The second thing, and I think you all have seen reports of this in the paper and so forth, but the rise in natural gas prices has just been horrendous over the last couple of years. And if you look, you know that we have gone from $2 to $3 per 1,000 cubic foot several years ago to as high as $25. That's just a tremendous increase for any organization to absorb. And while that is not the sole issue that LP&L has had to deal with, that has certainly been a compounding issue. I think this graph probably shows it a little bit better, but if you look back at January 99, the price was somewhere down in the $2 range. You can see the spike that occurred up in January of 01 and then so forth. But if you put a ruler on that chart, you know, what you see is that over the last number of years, the price of natural gas has just gotten extremely high. So the reasons for those losses are that, of course, the price, LP&L is dependent on the price of natural gas. We do not have the ability to utilize coal-producing generators as some of our competitors do. And as long as that situation exists, we are going to be burdened with the additional cost of what natural gas prices are reflecting today. So those are the types of things that we're dealing with. As we go forward, I'm going to let John take it from here and talk with you. But we appreciate your being here today. And John, I'll let you take the rest of it.
Thank you, Connie. Based on some recent publicity, I just want to let you know that I was approached, nor did I instigate anything I'm about to say here. Prior to March 23rd, a number of business and management decisions affected the financial condition of LP&L. These decisions included LP&L has been used, as lack of a better word, a cash cow for the city. The city had been taking more money than LP&L is making. The significant amounts of budget transfer from LP&L to the city's general fund ranged from 8 to 12% of the gross revenues of LP&L over the past 5 fiscal years. A portion of this was questionable assets in excess of $4.8 million. In 1994, LP&L had $36 million in cash. By 2003, LP&L is faced with $0 in reserves, $6 million in the red. From 97 to 03, the city took out about $21,958,000. There's a graph that shows year by year. Other city expenses covered by LP&L includes approximately $1 million in IT fees, information technology. $3 million, total of this is $3 million. In addition to that, there's $2 million in city street lights. Other items that were covered by LP&L was the city manager's secretary salary, Market Lubbock Inc. secretary salary, and for a one time only, a purchase of truck fleet for the city. In February 2003, during a period of extraordinary high natural gas prices, the city finance staff projected the operations continued the way they were. The Electric Enterprise Fund would have an operating loss of approximately $24 million. And luckily that didn't happen. Some of the reasons it didn't happen is on the next page here. Which I might add, one of the reasons it didn't happen, in our opinion, is the hiring of Carol McDonald and the staff. Attention was paid to some of the things that's coming up, particularly the fact that the budget eliminated approximately to eliminate approximately $7.7 million in transfers from the Electric Enterprise Fund to the general fund, particularly in this current fiscal year. Cut operating costs, which related to some of the layoffs that went on over there, and sought out new wholesale power arrangements and adjusted certain pricing structures. And it was a quick turnaround, as you know, and a vital turnaround for our city. High cost of gas, bad management decisions, the city taking money from LP&L, if continued, could have resulted in serious financial problems for the city. I want to emphasize what the judge said. We've gone through 32 years of this, and being a long time customer of LP&L, our company, Scoggin Dickey, for 75 years, we have a vested interest in this. And we really do appreciate your attention to this matter. It's very important to us, obviously, and to our city. So I'll turn it over to WR. Thank you.
John mentioned Carol McDonald. We have a number of other people that really assisted us in the preparation of our report. And Matt Wade on the legal counsel did an outstanding job. He worked hard and he went through many different ideas that we all had to come today with our conclusion. Also, John mentioned Carol McDonald. I compliment the council because in March of last year, we were really in the ditch. And you were smart to go and get Mr. McDonald out of retirement and bring him here, and he's done an admirable job. Connie mentioned the high cost of gas. Truly, that was something that we were facing. But Carol decided to buy wholesale power. It was cheaper to buy power and send it to our retail customers than to make it with high-priced gas. So that was one of the decisions that he and his group made. Now, our committee really wanted to go to charter election. Let me clear the air. That's what we wanted to do. As all of you know, we have a city manager form of government. And Mayor, you may need to correct me. I think the city attorney answers to the council, city secretary answers to the council. Is that it? And everyone else basically answers to the city manager up through the ranks. And we wanted to have a charter election whereby we would suggest to the public that this be a freestanding board and eliminate that chain of command. But during our deliberations, we discovered that it was going to cost a lot of money, $700,000 to $750,000, to prepay the bonds or to defease the bonds. So we thought at this time it would probably be smart for the city and LPNL not to go to that expense and to try to do this with ordinance, understanding that you all can create an ordinance and tomorrow or the next council meeting you can change that ordinance. So that's kind of the risk that we were running in suggesting an ordinance, whereby if you went to charter election, you'd have to go back to the citizens of Lubbock if you wanted to amend that. So today I will outline to you our recommendation, which will actually be suggesting that you pass an ordinance. And incidentally, our committee is unanimous in this particular report. The first slide there talks about the purpose of the electric utility. And let me say that this basically has not changed in the purpose for LPNL today. We have added a sentence there, while being financially self-sustaining. We think that's very important to try to ensure the health of Lubbock Power and Light. Now let's talk about the qualifications of board members for a moment. We suggest a 5-member board to be appointed by the City Council. And we suggest that their term of office would be 2 years. They could be reappointed 2 times, so anyone would not have more than a 6-year tenure at LPNL, and they would have to pass that around. They must be a resident and eligible voter of the city of Lubbock throughout their term. Board members will not be compensated, but if they have out-of-pocket expenses that can be documented and so forth, we all understand that, then they could be reimbursed for that. And then we have a section on conflict of interest, and you have an outline on that. It's quite a lengthy list, but basically we want to avoid any type of conflict of interest of board members. Now let's talk a few minutes about powers that are reserved to the City Council. And I would say that these powers you have now, and we're not suggesting that this be transferred to the board. One, that you would establish electrical rates for our citizens, for our customers. You would approve the budget. The board would submit the budget to you on an annual basis, and then you can approve it or disapprove it or come to some agreement concerning that. You would retain the right of eminent domain, being able to condemn property for high lines and things of that nature. You would also retain the responsibility of creating any kind of debt. For instance, if LPNL needed to come with a bond issue of some sort, the board would come to you as a council and outline to you why we needed that money, and then you can take action in that regard. We also would suggest that LPNL pay fees, such as real estate taxes. I think the city calls it pilot payment in lieu of taxes, because the city can't tax itself, so to speak, and also a franchise tax. But this will be covered in Section 6 a little more in detail. Now let's talk a little bit about the responsibilities and duties of the board. As I mentioned earlier, we would submit an annual budget and also an electric rate schedule to the City Council for your approval. The board could authorize and oversee an audit of Lubbock Power and Light. Now currently, as a practical matter, we would foresee that the audit firm for the city and the audit firm for LPNL would be the same. But if in the view of the board that they wanted a different audit firm, they could request that. Other duties of the board would be to govern, manage, and operate LPNL, including contracts. D, the city manager should seek advice and approval of the board regarding appointment or removing of the LPNL director. And the board's advice and findings should then be reported to the city council. Now let's talk a little bit about the director of electric utilities. The LPNL chief would be the administrative officer of Lubbock Power and Light, and that person would report to the board. He or she would be responsible for preparing an audit and rate schedule for LPNL. The director of utilities should not have any conflict of interest with regard to ownership in another competing utility and things of that nature within the city. And C, any violation of the above qualifications would be subject to termination. Now let's talk a few minutes about disbursement of net revenues. This is an interesting topic, and the committee firmly believes that LPNL can have a very bright future, and we would assume that in the future we would be out of the red spot that John Swacker described, and we would have some reserves and so forth, and then we would have revenues to talk about. First and foremost, the bond reserve must be there. And let me say, currently, the bond reserve is about $3 million and it's whole. So, so far, we haven't violated any bond covenants with regard to the reserves for our outstanding debt of Lubbock Power and Light. Then we would suggest, after that is met, that we would have an operations reserve. And the committee suggests that this would be 3 months operating expenses. Currently, our operating expense per month is $7 million. I wish it was $7. We'd be declaring dividends pretty quick. So this would equate to about a $21 million reserve for operations. We also would suggest a rate stabilization reserve of $14 million, or 2 months operating expenses. And the reason for that is periodically, as many of the people have already shown, we have fluctuations in raw cost of fuel, whether you're buying it from a XL or whoever, or if you're doing it with gas. So it'll kind of smooth out the cost to the ratepayers of Lubbock Power and Light. And then third, we would suggest an electric utility development reserve. This would aid in the development of our city. 1 month's operating expenses are $7 million. Periodically, you will have a subdivision, or you will come in and you'll have to outlay a lot of cash for underground utilities or whatever. It may be an overhead line, and so this would assist the current operations to have that in reserve. Now, after all of the reserves have been fully funded by LPNL, we will be required to refund to the ratepayers of LPNL no more than 6 months after the end of the year any profits that was made by LPNL. Now, this is different from the way we operate now. Currently, any profits go to the city of Lubbock, and then they disperse it. It was the feeling of the committee that those ratepayers would prefer to invest their money or spend their money rather than sending it to the city and having them to invest it for them. So we think this will be good for our public. We think it will be good for the customers of Lubbock Power and Light, but bear in mind, this is going to be a while. This is going to be a while before we'll have these reserves established, because we're going to have to get LPNL on a firm footing and making money to be able to establish those reserves. Now, with regard to amendments, the City Council may not amend, delete, or change any provision in the ordinance until first conducting a public hearing. The way it is now, if you want to change an ordinance, you can do that without a public hearing, and we would encourage you to put this in the ordinance that we're suggesting. And then, of course, the public hearing must be published, the notice of the public hearing. And then finally, we would suggest that if you decide to pass our recommendation today, that we would recommend that the City Council appoint the board after the ordinance is in effect. So in summary, let me say, you know, there are a lot of, we're not trying to point our finger at anybody in this whole process. All we're interested in doing is what we think is best for Lubbock Power and Light, best for the city, and best for our citizens. We think that there were problems with regard to the city administration. They've outlined that. For instance, LPNL was being overcharged for services that the city was providing for LPNL to the tune of about $3 million a year. In addition to that, from 97 to 2003, they took out almost $22 million, and this was at a time when LPNL was not even making a profit. Wasn't even making a profit. We also had some management situations of not adjusting quickly to the high cost of gas that Connie has talked about. And as a result of these things, we were facing serious financial problems, not only for LPNL, but also for the city of Lubbock. As JQ has outlined, unanimous reports by the goal of the 70s, twice in 72 and 73, the LPNL Advisory Board and the Bloom-Rosen Report in 72, the City Manager's Oversight Committee in 2003, and now the Governance Committee that you all have appointed after thorough deliberation and discussion and a lot of time invested have reported the same recommendation to the City Council of Lubbock. We think that you need to run LPNL like a business. And as you see, the Citizens Committee for over 30 years have presented the idea of a freestanding board to govern LPNL, and we unanimously endorse this proposal. Now, we'll take questions.
We may have some.
And I may want to delegate that, but I'll take the heat for a while.
Debbie, I have a few questions.
All right.
They may all be fairly easy to answer. On the audit committee, or the not audit committee, on the audit that you're recommending,
Right.
I would assume that whoever is performing that audit would be different than who does the city's audit.
Not necessarily. For instance, currently, I believe the city has employed Pete Marwick, KPMG, to do your audit, and KPMG. And, you know, that's a great
So it
audit
wouldn't
firm.
make your committee any difference if
No.
it was the same
No.
group audit in the city as
Theoretically,
LPNL?
Mayor, at some point, you know, there might be a firm that the board that you appoint might not think they are qualified or something of that nature, and that's the reason it's in there. But so far as a practical application, I would assume it'd probably be the same one.
This 5-member board would do away with the current board structure at LPNL.
The current board structure is an advisory board.
Right.
Entirely. This is more of an operating board.
Right.
And some of the qualifications that we outlined was that the people that you decide, if you decide to pass this, they need to have extensive business experience as one of the qualifications, one of the primary qualifications.
Do we have any estimates on, and this may be for Carol, do we have any estimates on how long it would take to get the reserves put back in place as the committee has outlined for the operations, for the rate stabilizations and the,
No, we could guess at it, Mark, but we've got a lot of uncertain things happening right now, and I'm not sure.
okay, but we're talking about years, not months.
Talking about maybe 5 years, 3 to 5 years.
So you're talking about $42 million of total reserves outside of the bond reserve, and that currently is funded. So it just depends on how good Carroll and his staff are on making profits. And I know he has a number of things in the works that's going to be pretty good, but it's going to take some time. Now, one way to cure that, if the city wanted to pay back what they had taken from LPNL over a period of time, we'd be a lot quicker, wouldn't it, Carroll?
Mayor, WR, you're making a real good point right there. Would you talk about any recommendations that y'all would have on this debt load that LPNL is now carrying?
We believe, so far as the debt load is concerned with regard to the bonds, we believe...
Not the bonds, that it owes the city. I'm sorry, I didn't make myself clear.
We disagree a little bit on whether it's owed to the city or if the city owes LPNL.
Yeah, would you expound on that?
Yes, sir, and that's pretty firm. So far as
And how
what
much is the figure we're talking about?
Pardon me?
How much are we talking about, dollar-wise?
Well, currently, we have an overdraft of about
No, it's under $8 million.
under $8 million. When Carroll came, we were in the red about, how much? 14 million. So you can see that LPNL is making some progress now to cover that. But the $21 million, even just since 1997, almost $22 million.
Count to 18 million for the $3 million overcharges each year, and it makes that $41 million.
Now, we received some figures yesterday, Councilman Warren, that is not in our presentation because we didn't have time to do it. But over a period of years, and someone may have that, the city has had quite a bit of money transferred to it.
In other words, the city has sucked a lot of money out of LPNL that was over and above profits that it otherwise made.
That's
And
correct.
that's this debt that we're talking about right now that the committee would, I'm assuming, recommend be wiped off the books because it's actually debt that the city owes to itself. Is that fair?
That's correct. Our feeling is we should start out at least even. We shouldn't be in the overdraft, so to speak. Or in the
How much
red.
are we currently carrying in the debt from LPNL to the city?
A little under $8 million. Beverly should have
How's that being paid back? Is that being paid back monthly?
when we make a profit, they take it off.
What's happening, Mayor, as we
We're not
make a
getting
profit,
it.
it goes into cash, and so the deficit, the overdraft or the red just keeps going down. So with a little time, that thing will be in the black.
Y'all's recommendation is that it would just, let the city write that off?
Yes, sir, it is. And the quicker we can do that, the quicker we will start building reserves. Because I think it's so important. You know me pretty well, Mark. I like reserves.
Well, let me see if I understand it.
Sir?
LPNL, or the city, took money from LPNL until all the reserves were gone.
That's
Then they
correct.
continued to take money from LPNL, and now LPNL owes them that money back. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
Okay.
So
That's the
basically,
way they look at it. That's the way some people look at it. We
It's
look
very,
at it
it's
that
very
the
similar to
city
what we
owes
did
us.
with the golf course,
I understand.
where we had a receivable to ourselves on the books that
That's all.
was funny money.
That's right.
so
In other words, the
basically,
city stole money from LPNL until there was nothing more to steal, and then they said, now, we're gonna take some more, but you owe it to us.
Oh, a cash cow, Mr. Mayor.
That's right.
Cash cow.
well, like
That's right.
in 1994, you had $36 million in the bank, Carol, when you were retired. And in a 10-year spread, or less than 10 years, that got used up. In addition, you had a loss of $22 million, and you took $18 million on top of that, and our bond indebtedness went up to a high of $70 million, give or take government accounting. And does that include the WTMPA?
Yes.
That includes WTMPA bonds also?
LPNL is 52 or 3.
So in a 10-year period, you know, this horse has been rode hard. You know, and I guess what we're doing when we take money out of LPNL when it was losing a profit or losing money in the last 6 years, And then we were going through the back door, because how do you take money out of something that's losing money? You got to go through the back door, go around to the alley, and go to your cash reserves of the city, and just take money there, run it through LP&L, and keep propping up this facade.
And then I would assume there would be a receivable from LP&L to the city, or payable from LP&L to the city, and the city would reflect the
Which then
receivable.
could affect the balance sheet and your
That's right.
books, because it looks like you're cooking the books or misrepresenting the books. It inflames a series of a lot of issues there, a lot of questions that could be asked.
In addition to that money, there's those indirect costs, street lights, salaries being paid. I said in addition to that 22 million, there's indirect costs, the 3 million we're talking about annually, basically, salaries being paid, street lights being maintained. The best that we could identify. Now, I don't know, there may be other stuff out there.
What you're saying is, John, you can make a good case that the city owes LP&L a whole lot more money than LP&L owes the city. But y'all would be satisfied just to go back to zero.
Well, we weren't, a while back when we met, some of us, present company included,
I
thought
can
that you
imagine.
owed the money back to LP&L from that standpoint, to go ahead and pay it back whenever y'all could show some kind of profit back to
Right.
them and pay us.
Well, what y'all are recommending today is the approval of the ordinance, which you
That's
put
correct.
together.
That's
But
correct.
I'm assuming that, well, it's not an assumption, you just said it. You're also recommending that we put the debt that LP&L owes the city back to zero.
That would be
Right
very
off that
nice.
debt.
Then we can start building reserves.
Thank you.
Jim, if I could, I don't have that figure right in front of me, but as I recall, since 1978, the city, not in the indirect cost, but just taking money, has taken $122 million from LP&L.
I have another thought. Of course, we pass item 35 today on first reading. I'm assuming that's a resolution, so it only requires, it's an ordinance, so 2 readings. Would become effective on the 19th then. If we're going to waive that $8 million, forgive the debt if it's debt, why not move forward with a charter election to solve this problem permanently, and work with the bond companies to see if we can't get the defeasance of those bonds waived, but if not, pay the $700,000, get it done before there's another $21,958,000 gone.
Is that
Me like
a
that.
possibility to get the bond, the defeasance waived? I mean, we'd have to go to the individual bondholders, I'm assuming, wouldn't we? So that'd be kind of a logistics problem. Yeah.
We were told as a committee that that would take anywhere from 5 to 6 months minimum, and that it could take a longer period than that, and that's when we came up with the recommendation of going with the ordinance now and starting the ordinance now, and if you as a council chose to go the charter route, defeats of the bond and so forth, that process could take place. But the starting of the ordinance now would create a positive situation for LP&L.
But if we went,
Well, and Bill, the House offered us another solution that if you'd enact this ordinance, you can look at a lot of things, and that is that it's possible to amend the bonds so that they would permit this to happen. And what you have to do is send a notice to all the bondholders seeking a majority of them to agree to it. And he had a figure of about $75,000 that Summer City did that. We don't know exactly what it would cost here. So you might be looking at something that's a whole lot cheaper than $700,000 and get it in shape where you could have a charter amendment election.
Well, we could do this first, and then
That's what we'd like
That's
to
what
see you
we're
do.
recommending. This is an interim step, Jim. If we can get this in place and start operating, we are already, I know that Carol is talking to the bond people to try to get the notice from all of the bond holders, but that takes time. And see, we were trying to match up our report so that we could go to the election in May. And we couldn't do that after we discovered the expense involved.
Councilman Gilbert, if in the ordinance, it's 6A is addressing what you exactly talked about, is the $8 million and getting flush with it and starting off. It addresses that in the ordinance itself.
Beverly, regarding this $8 million, do you recognize that number?
I'm sorry, I was trying to verify some information and I stepped out of the room, so I'm
What?
not up to speed on.
What's a description of that $8 million? What,
They used to call it deferred revenue. It's what's the debt that LPNL owes the city that you're
The
capturing?
negative cash, or from a negative cash?
Yes.
The negative cash, I think at this point is just a little bit over $7 million.
okay. How does that show up on the books?
It's on the balance sheet.
As what?
It's negative cash. It's a
What does that
negative
mean?
asset.
I don't
Well,
understand that.
it's like you've overdrawn your bank account. So that's $7 million.
How's it described as a line item?
Well, we have cash and it's negative $7 million. I don't know if I'm kind of walking into the.
It's a negative current asset.
Well, I hope we don't have that situation, so we're not used to that.
You understand, you said the watchword, run LPNL like a business. We've run it like one that went out of business.
And basically, the city has consolidated cash, so we might have, $90 million in cash, and so some accounts have positive cash, some accounts may have negative cash, and that's, I don't know if that's.
That's being charged to
that's-
LPNL to be recollected. That's how you're treating it.
That's a little bit better. There is an account called Consolidated Cash Account.
Yes.
And the police department, they collect their whatever revenue that the police department collects from confiscated goods or whatever. There's a number in there. LP&L, it happens to be a minus 7 point something. Water department, they collected all their water accounts, and so it goes into there. Water's different because it's a different account, but it's a consolidated cash. It's just all the cash that the city has thrown into one pot.
Our total portfolio of cash.
And then we break that down into LP&L and the fire department, police department, streets, parks, everybody that has or might have cash. Or
All of our funds will have a separate account, but it's consolidated in the cash.
So what we're talking about is doing essentially, I guess at one time there was a golf course fund that had a negative $2 million cash,
That's correct.
and we just wrote that off because it showed up as a receivable over here, and so we balanced those two out. And so what we're talking about is that if we just wrote that off, it would be a receivable from LP&L into the cash fund, and the cash is negative, so we wipe off the receivable from LP&L also.
Right. It's a receivable on the accounts where we've borrowed the money technically from. So if we would write this off to the general fund, then the general fund cash would go down by the 7 point whatever million. LP&L would end up being a zero or whatever level we would start them out at. And so basically for the general fund, what you would do is you would zero out their working capital. Because that's about.
Let me, Councilman Morrison, the way we look at it is receivable from the city to LP&L is a lot larger than what we're talking about. And that's what these gentlemen and ladies have outlined to you. So,
Right, and I'm one that says that's water under the bridge. Just start fresh and get everybody even and go from here on out. I've got a couple of questions, Mayor. Is there any sense from any of the research or Judge, the experience that you have on why previous councils did not go along with the recommendations from the citizens?
I don't know if anybody ever heard a word from any council person or mayor as to why they were not going to do it. They just take, like the Bloom-Rosen report, and just buried it in the city minutes, and that was the end of it. And we went back twice and asked them to do something, and they were very courteous and nice to us, and absolutely never did anything. They'd do something like, make a motion to note that the report's now here, and that's it.
I think it's logical to believe, though, the city and previous councils like the fact that they can draw money out of LP&L. I mean, to me, that's the answer.
Is there Mr. Collier, do you have a sense, and I realize I'm asking you to project into history and somebody else's mind maybe, but would the rates, LPNL rates have been lower if it had been set up the way you're proposing for say the last 5 to 10 years? Would LPNL rates have actually been able to be decreased below what they were?
Well, you can't decrease them below cost of production. That's the first thing. But we would have had a lot of reserve or money that we would have generated through profits, which in our case, we would have paid a patronage refund back to the ratepayers of Lubbock Power and Light. So irregardless of that, electric rates are low compared to any other city that I know of. And we've got a whole list of them.
So the rates may not have gone down any, but there would have been another subline down there that said, what is it we call it, ownership? No, the locally owned dividend.
Home-owned advantage.
Home-owned advantage. That number might have been a bigger number.
Well, to the public, it seems like to me, if they paid their bill and then they get a credit or they get a check at the end of the year, you know, that in effect is having a lower rate.
Right.
That really is the homeowner advantage.
I recall.
It's going to be a terrific advantage if we'll do it.
I recall several years ago, Carol, when you were director at the LPNL, we got the Christmas bonus. What year was that?
Gosh, I've slept since then, TJ. We gave $1 million.
Right, went back
back one
to the
Christmas.
ratepayers, that's correct. But you're correct, WR, back in goals for the 70s,
Yes, sir.
as I sit here and recall, that was highly talked about. Well, by now it would have become a reality, but it never did. You're correct, very much so. I was there, I heard those words.
And I think it's important that Lubbock Power and Light pay a franchise fee and pay a real estate taxes or payment in lieu of taxes. But we're advocating that not happen until our reserves are met, because we think it's so important to have a healthy electric utility.
Well, and I think we made that decision last year when we
You did.
we didn't force LPNL to make a payment of money they didn't have.
I've got just a couple of other questions. Is there any reason that a council, this board comes to the council with a recommendation on a rate? Is there any reason why the council could or would choose to set the rate at a different level? And let me give you a scenario. It seems that we had some discussion about needing to raise the rates in the past because of gas prices going up, and the council made the decision that, based on the information we were getting from staff, that this gas price was just a blip on the screen, and so we chose not to take any action at that time. And it continued like that. But if the board comes to us with a recommendation, is there an obligation or does the council have any basis for making a decision other than what the board recommends?
It was the feeling of the committee that you are the elected officials. And so rate setting should be left with elected officials and not delegated to some individual board that we're outlining.
But
So ultimately, the public could have, at the next election, they probably remember that.
But based on the scenario you put together of the makeup of this board and the way the funds are managed, there wouldn't be any benefit to the council to set them at an arbitrarily high rate to create this cash flow stream because the council doesn't get its hands on it.
You've hit a nerve. That's exactly what's happening.
Well, we still have a competitive situation, too.
You have a competitive situation that you're going to have to deal with, and that LPNL is going to have to deal with. But in the past, we have had both LPNL and Southwestern Public Service come to the or XL come to the council asking for a rate increase, and it would go along. Well, what happens is that means more money for the city once you get those, if in fact they have been making a profit.
Mayor, whenever this process all started, I was skeptical about it and leery of changing something that I thought just changing it wasn't necessarily going to make it better, but I believe this committee has come up with two justifications to me. One, for 30 years, citizens have been recommending it. This is the second or third generation that has dealt with it. We should kind of go along with our constituents after a while that we need to make some changes. But the other one, which I believe is absolutely the biggest issue in my mind, the council still retains the authority, as you're saying, in setting the rates and naming these board members. But when you take the money away from us, we're not inclined to dicker with it and stick our finger in there and pull some out.
Trying to remove the temptation.
I think taking the temptation away from us, whether it be me or whoever sits on this council 3 times after I'm gone, you're taking that temptation away, and we, just like everybody else, are government bodies, and we like to find our own little reasons for spending somebody's money. And I think what you've done is a great move and a great recommendation, and Mayor, I wholeheartedly support your initiative to do this, and I think it's time we take action and listen to what the citizens are telling us.
Mr. Collier, I had one question, just to real clarify to the citizens, because we're talking about two types of people that are affected by LPNL: the ratepayers and the taxpayers. It's both of them that are affected. And over the course of 30 years, the ratepayers and taxpayers have said to their elected leaders, this needs to change. You've got to change it. There'll come a point in time where the choices you're making are going to have consequences that are going to be bad. And we skated for 30 years in and out among the wolves and come close. And last spring, we came very close to making bad choices, to suffering severe consequences for the ratepayers and the taxpayers. And we got a unique moment in time in history to fulfill what our forefathers and our fathers, in some cases, have asked their community to do. So in essence, we need a charter election because we are our worst enemy, as we can tell by spending money, transferring money we didn't have money, and secondly, by accumulating debt. And the debt now stops us from having a charter election because we can't defease the bonds without spending a lot of money. So the first option is taken off the table till we get a clarification from the bondholders. How do we handle the debt? So it's not that we don't want to. The debt is keeping us from letting it happen. Second thing we can do is go the ordinance route. And it gives us a trial period to see how we make this separation, how we can iron out some kinks, how we can tweak some things and to make it work and make for a positive thing. I've been very, very hard on us as elected officials because when we have money to spend, as Frank says, it's a temptation to try to do something and hopefully do something positive. But councils, we're at the mercy of staff. If staff doesn't give us accurate information, bad information leads to bad decisions. And a lot of times councils in the past didn't have accurate information to steer the city necessarily in the right direction. And what you have come up with are some guidelines and some protections and things to protect the citizens, the taxpayers, the ratepayers, and elected people, city council people, from anything that may be misrepresentations. And just to clarify one more time, and Beverly, you can help me on this, is in the last 6 years, we transferred money when LPNL was losing money. The city of Lubbock took a check from LPNL, and they were losing money. Now, how does LPNL, when it's losing money, write a check to the city? Where's that money come from?
Well, and that's where the negative cash occurs.
That's the result of it, but where's it come from?
It's built up as a receivable and a payable on the
It
balance.
comes from the city's cash reserves.
That's right.
So we
Money
create,
we owe ourselves.
That's
Right.
correct.
so in essence, we were taking from ourselves, run it through a department of the city, which is not a corporation of the city, a department, and then transferring that money into the city general fund again in a whirlwind of transfers that, in millions of dollars terms, no sane person could hardly track.
Since 2000, we've had a negative cash situation at LPNL.
So it's about choices and consequences. And we have a chance today to make a choice to stop any further risk of bad consequences.
Councilman Bourne, historically, the city had gone to LPNL for cash. And LPNL was in a loss position, and they continued to go to LPNL for cash. And so they handled it with their accounting procedures, and today's where we are.
That's what got us in trouble. Folks call that kiting, don't they?
And result,
You're not going to get into that, TJ.
In the brokerage business, they used to talk about short selling, which is kind of the same thing, that he who sells what isn't his'n pays it back or goes to prison.
Councilman Gilbert. Thank you, Mayor. WR, two questions. One, the first one, I'm a taxpayer in Lubbock, Texas, and I'm also a customer of Lubbock Power and Lights. Would you address the rationale for paying profits back to customers rather than dividends to taxpayers?
There was quite a bit of discussion about that, and we all are in agreement with what we're proposing. So there's not one or two out here that didn't agree with it. We're all in agreement. We feel like that the taxpayers will receive money from either the franchise tax or payment in lieu of taxes when we get this thing straightened out, okay? So in a sense, all taxpayers would be receiving a dividend because most of the facilities that are taxed are within the city limits of Lubbock. So you can take that and think about it a little bit, but most of the taxable assets are within the city limits, which adheres to the city. It was the feeling of the committee that if it hadn't been for the ratepayers, we never would have had LPNL.
Right.
So,
One other comment. Consistent with the purpose. The purpose is primary purpose is provision of dependable and reliable electric service at reasonable and competitive rates. It's not to fund the city or to reduce taxes.
Yeah,
That's
and
the
you
reason the
also-
ratepayers will be receiving the money back.
Right, and you might add that it just makes us more competitive, too.
that's correct.
Well, Jim, I'd point out one other thing, if I can explain it exactly. In order to take money from LP&L and use that and not have to do something about the tax rate and say, well, we're saving the taxpayers' money, that holds the electric rates up. And guess what? There's a beneficiary in that who's not going to make any contribution in lieu of taxes, who is the competitor.
Right.
And that money over and above what they need for their electric rates is going to go in their pockets. And so what's happening is that the ratepayers of LP&L are being asked not only to support profits over at that business, but they're doing that to save a lot of taxpayers some money. And so it's really just not fair to the folks who use LP&L.
Good point. Good point. The other thing, thank you, that's
Well, Mr.
great
Mayor,
explanation.
I know we're running behind, but I'd had a couple of questions as well.
Let me get my
Yeah.
second question here right quick. A minute ago, Craig pointed out the section in the ordinance that addresses this writing off, if you will, of the receivable. However, it's not, I mean, this is kind of veiled. It's not, doesn't say that real directly. Matt, could you address that?
Sure.
And what we could do to change it?
Sure. And the board, the final ordinance they were looking for, they talk about Section 5, Section 6. In the formal ordinance, we're amending our Code of Ordinances, so I've put in the actual section numbers of the Code of Ordinances that you're going to talk about. When they talk about Section 6A, they're talking about on the copy you have, section 2-484A. And it says there in the very beginning, when it starts talking about how the net revenue is going to be dispersed, it says prior to reimbursing any other fund of the city. And then it says paying any fee equivalent to franchise fee, making any payment in lieu of taxes, and so forth. What that very first phrase was meant to do, while I do, and I don't want to speak for the commission, but I do believe it was the commission's belief that the debt that the LP&L owes to the city should be wiped off. They didn't put that directly in here and says that. I think that they would all agree to go ahead and do that. What they did say was, if they're going to require LP&L to pay that debt back to the city, then they're going to do it after the reserves are built up, after the franchise fee and pilot have been paid, as the very last thing that you do.
See, I don't think that's what they're saying. I think they're saying that should be done first, and then let's commence with all this other stuff.
I think that it's the commission's belief, and Mr. Carey, correct me if I'm wrong, they absolutely agree with you to go ahead and wipe it clean and wipe it off the books. I think what they put in their presentation was, if they aren't going to agree to that, then let's at least make them pay it after the reserves are all built up and everything else is taken care of first. We can change that.
Could we get some language before this afternoon that we could add as an amendment to this ordinance to get that handled?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Jim, the way
Well,
I see
before
it-
11:30,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah, before 11:30, excuse
Yes,
me.
sir.
Whenever it's time. Sooner than later.
This is just a matter of timing.
Which day?
I mean, the quicker we get the reserves built up, well, the quicker we start paying taxes.
Right.
I want to go back to one thing.
You can build up the reserves quicker when you don't have a burden
Of the overdraft,
of the overdraft.
yeah.
I want to go back to one thing real quick, Victor, if you don't mind. On the charter issue. Now, I'm of the opinion that we're too late today if we wanted to call a charter for May. Is that correct?
It's going to be, I'm not exactly sure where we are in the timing, but we would need a 90 days prior to the date of the election, so I'd have to backtrack on that because we'd like that.
90 days would
Pre-submitted.
be February 15th.
And our problem there, Mayor, is, as the commission has pointed out, we've got this issue with regard to the bond covenants. If we are to go back to the bond holders and see if there is an issue that we could resolve there, our estimate from bond counsel is that that's going to take a little bit of time to do that. We don't know exactly how much time, but it's going to take us some time. We may or may not be ready. That would raise then the question of whether or not it would be workable for the city to proceed with the ordinance. Let us have a little bit of time to look at those issues and then perhaps consider the possibility of the charter election, perhaps in the fall or on another general election date.
My concern is, especially after hearing what the judge said about this being brought to councils for the last 30-plus years, is that, yeah, we can pass an ordinance at 11:30 this morning. We can do second reading 19th. There are elections May 15th. There are 5 members of this council that are going to be on that ballot or up. And the last meeting in May, another council come in here and change it. And it's another 30 years before we're talking about it, and we lose another, I don't know how many millions of dollars.
They'd have to move the slate probably,
We
wouldn't
do- One of the things that we put in there, was the public hearings. And we feel
Well-
like that's real important. I understand exactly what you're saying, but,
I understand.
that was a checks and balances of that.
But you can have a public hearing and a resolution, and the council doesn't have to
You're right.
call a public hearing.
You're right.
Doesn't require one, it can ask
That
for
was the
one.
reason for the public hearing in there, because we realized that was a,
I guess what I would ask the council is to commit, and at 11:30, whenever we take action on item, I think I called it 35 earlier, it's actually 34. 34A. To consider a time deadline to take this to a charter election of the end of the year.
I would say as soon as we get word from the bond council on how we can get the bonds amended, and I hope to do it by as late as, early as September at the latest.
I'm just saying,
I
by
have
the
a-
end of the year.
Mayor, I have a suggestion. If we have not run out of time for a charter amendment election on May 15th, if we wrote the charter amendment saying that something to the effect, upon the ability to defease the bonds, whatever it takes, that this section shall become effective, meaning that that LP&L becomes a freestanding board and so forth. In other words, I think it's legal to have an election, like a constitutional amendment election, that if this happens, then this becomes effective. And if we wrote the provision that that this amendment to the charter will become effective, meaning the independence and reporting to an operating board and not to the city manager and so forth, upon the bonds being defeased. If that takes 6 months, if it takes a year, if it takes 2 days, whatever the time, then that section becomes effective. That way we could have the election, and the citizens, if they approve that, then it's simply a matter of the mechanics of going about and making the defeasance of the bond.
The problem with that is if you couldn't get the bond holders to agree to defease the bonds, then you've got to go back to a charter election. So what I would prefer to do is put it on there.
You can't, you wouldn't want to try to do it if you couldn't defease the bonds anyway.
Go back to running as with an ordinance.
Well, we could.
There are some
We
different-
could defease the bonds. It just costs $700,000. Is that the
Plus a lot of additional interest in the future, because then they'd be revenue bonds, which are going to carry a much higher coupon rate.
Councilman Martin, we talked to the bond counsel concerning this, and what I heard him say, and I think our committee heard, was that the council could not delegate that to the board. So that you know, in the bond covenants, if you had said council or trustee, something of that nature, then we could have proceeded with the election. But once we heard that, we kind of put a stop to trying to go to meet the deadlines that we were given. We
Well, I
were given some
understand.
deadlines on February 1st.
I'm with you, Mr. Collier. What I'm saying is, so that we don't have to hold another election or a special election and spend additional money or the cost of an election, is you have an issue on this ballot that says for or against. The language, and included in that language is this section will become effective in the charter upon refinancing of LP&L's existing debt. So if it takes place in 6 months, then it automatically goes into effect. If it takes 2 years, it goes into effect. If we get it done next week, it goes into effect.
Are you saying that in lieu of an ordinance?
Well, I would pass the ordinance now because, we don't know if the election's going to pass. And if it passes, great.
Go for that language.
Mayor, one thing that is available, it wasn't finalized, but we were just at the last stages of preparing what we were going to say to you should be put on the ballot for the people to vote on. And so there's been some work done on that. Just as we were ready to, as a committee, to kind of get the last language that we were going to bring to you about a charter amendment, then this bond thing came up and we abandoned that effort. But we could sure go back and take another look at it and have you something in a hurry.
Can we call that election by resolution, or is that by ordinance?
I think we can call that charter election by resolution. The charter says that you call it in the most expeditious fashion possible. We've looked at that issue. I believe that could be called by resolution. If we can do it on one reading, then we're going to be real close to the 90 days. If we call it on the 19th, we could even have a special council.
I mean, I like the language that Tom said. One, we can pass the resolution today. We get this on the ballot in May. It puts it to rest. Either the voters vote it up or they vote it down. And then based on the language he just put in there, if it takes 5 years to refinance, then it goes into effect. But a council is going to be hard pressed if 90% of the voters say do that to go back and change this ordinance until the bonds are refinanced.
And I would just add, I do want to take a look at this and make sure that if we pass it on a contingency, I would say that it's acceptable for us to put that language. I would say upon refinancing of the bonds or on permission of the bondholders to change the covenants at a cost not to exceed.
We can't call the election today anyway. We're going to have a special
Those are
council meeting on
details.
that.
We're policy people.
John, I think, did you have something to add?
No, we wanted to make sure that there was, besides defeasing, you put in there to amend the bond covenants. That's the cheaper route and be the, fiduciary responsibility. We feel that's the
Sure
best route.
cheaper than the transfers, I can tell you that.
Well, we
Sure,
can't,
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
we can't do that today anyway. We'd have to call a special meeting. So.
Mayor, there's one other consideration, I think, and let's say that we're able to get the ball teed up sooner than later in terms of a charter election. This council, it's my understanding, can't do any electioneering to get that done, so we're going to have to look to an outside group. And can we assume that that your committee would be ready, willing, and able to promote the passage of that if it comes to that?
Councilman, we have had quite a bit of input from the citizens, and we think that there's plenty of people out there that would assist us in the election process.
So
And
we
we
can-
would participate.
We can depend on y'all to lead the charge?
That, and we've got some others that would want to.
Good. I figured you would have.
But if you are,
You've been waiting 30 years for that, Charlie.
I want to clarify this because we also have a bond election that'll be on the May ballot. And I'm assuming that if Councilman Gilbert is at a debate, he's there as a candidate, not as a member of the council. If somebody asks him a question about it, he can answer it.
Absolutely, personally, my personal opinion.
That's right.
Sure.
We don't need advice on that. We just
But we're going to have a group that can,
We
rally
understand
the
that,
troop
and
and
we're
get the thing
prepared to
passed.
move
Right.
forward on that.
Thank you.
WR only had a couple of questions,
Sure.
and before I ask my questions, let me play like I'm Paul Harvey here and kind of give the rest of the story to this deal, because I have been on this council 10 years, and the word has been kicked around again and again, previous councils. Well, I was part of previous councils that got us somewhat into this mess, and for that reason, I think it's important we kind of clarify a little bit. One of the main reasons why we're in the fix that we're in now and slowly getting out of it is because of the unforeseen rise in gas prices. And in fact, previous councils had hired gas consultants that we relied heavily on to give us advice and counsel concerning whether or not this was going to be a blip that we could ride through or not. And I think that's important that we make clear to the public that, it was one of those things where previous councils were just kind of acting blindly and not making decisions based on some information given to us, whether it be by management or actually consultants hired by the city. The other point that I'd like to make is that...
Let me address that just a little bit. Our committee has tried to be very objective about this, not trying to, we don't have an axe to grind in the thing. No, I know, and I think that Connie and John have outlined gas prices as a big contributor to the problem, and I'm not, we all agree with that.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate that, WR. It's just as an elected official, I don't mind accepting blame and the responsibility for bad choices, but I also don't want to have that albatross around my neck if in fact it was based on the best available information we had available at the time. Because I think everybody on this dais knows there's going to be some votes that you take and some positions you take that are going to make you look like a superstar, and some that are going to make you look like you're the dunce in the classroom.
Could I add one thing to it? And this is true of what brought about this. That has not been said up to now, and that is that there were money being loaned and proper charges not being made to the West Texas Municipal Power Agency that the council was unaware of. It amounted to millions of dollars, and that in part contributed to the deficit that existed over there at LP&L. And the council had nothing to do with any of that.
Well, and I appreciate that, and that was going to be another point that I made, that sometimes we were acting in a void.
Right.
So it's important to keep that in mind. But I will also tell you that I do believe that generally speaking, this council, and maybe not this council, but previous councils have viewed LP&L as a source of revenue for either pet projects or for other ventures that sometimes come back to bite you. And I will tell you, for example, $4 million to Texas Tech University is probably a classic example of that. And I won't take responsibility for that because I voted against that one. But there are many other examples such as that where we turn to LPNL. And the last point I'll make on that deal is that we were always told, and I think rightly so to a certain extent, that there was a relationship between LPNL and the funds transfer to the general fund and the property tax rate that we were having to either maintain or try to keep at a certain rate and not increase, and we relied heavily on those fund transfers in order to accomplish that. Now, some will argue, well, the other alternative was not to have a fund transfer when you couldn't afford it and just start cutting jobs or start cutting services, and in fact, we've done that here recently. So, it is a matter of choices, as Gary Boren has said earlier. Some of them have turned out to be pretty good, and some have turned out not to be so hot. Now, let me get to the meat of the questions I've got. Under authority, duties, and responsibility of the board, the one that raises a concern in my mind is D. City manager should seek advice and approval of the board regarding appointing or removing of the LPNL director. The board's advice and findings should then be reported to the city council. So I just want to make sure that how I understand that. It says city manager should seek advice and approval of the board. So if the city manager, for whatever reason, finds that the LPNL director is not performing adequately, are you saying the city manager is going to have to get the approval of the board to fire him?
No. We're not saying that. He does have that authority, and that's one of the comments that we made in the very beginning, and that is we're under a city manager form of government, and he answers to them, so he could fire. But I'll tell you that the board will be over here to talk to the council about it if they disagreed with the city manager.
But that's under the ordinance and not under a charter amendment.
That's correct. Now, if we go to charter, then that person, the director of utilities, would answer directly to the board, and you would not have that conflict.
Well, and that's why I wanted to clarify it, because it's that word approval that kind of jumped out at me. And you're saying, no, they don't need the approval of the board.
When it comes down
that word approval there is that he goes over and says, here is the person I'm going to hire. That's what I have decided, or I have decided to terminate this person, and he's just seeking for them to agree with him so that he can come to the council and say, I'm letting the electric utility director grow, and I have the approval of the board. The board approves of this action, but not that they have a final say in it.
Okay.
He still is the hire and fire.
Now, as far as the LPNL to pay fees under Section 6, what's the difference going to be between what they're paying now and what is seen to be in the future that they will be paying? Any difference?
Well, first of all, currently, you can't collect them unless you run up the overdraft, because they haven't got any money.
Correct. Or you just continue to add to that overdraft.
I guess you could say that.
So are the fees going to be the same, though?
I don't know what the fees are exactly. I will say this, payment in lieu of taxes and a franchise fee would be capped at 5% total. That's our proposal.
Which is consistent with what others are paying?
That's kind of a loaded question, because others may not have the taxable assets within the city limits of Lubbock. That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
And LPNL has a concentration of assets within the city limits of Lubbock. Also, Councilman, the way pilot has been figured has been based on historical cost of the asset. So pilot is being figured on whatever the thing cost in the beginning and not taking into consideration depreciation. And it's my understanding that no appraisal has been made of the assets of LPNL with regard to pilot. Am I right or wrong on that?
I'm not aware of an appraisal.
And of course, I've talked with the tax appraisal district and others within the county that have generating plants. They have been appraised. So I think there's probably, since you brought it up, I think it's a good point that we need to discuss. I think that's another instance of being padded. I think that possibly LPNL has been paying in excess of ad valorem taxes or pilot.
It has been according to the CAFR. Last year's CAFR, 2002, 2003, and I read it to the council back then, is that LPNL was being overcharged for all these indirect costs more than a business would be. That was in auditor's notes.
Well, and I wouldn't be opposed to having us to take a look at that, and I'm not ready at this point to either agree or disagree with you. I just bring it up as an issue. The other one, WR, is I'm finding it somewhat interesting that Carol McDonald is saying, well, it's going to take us 3 to 5 years to build up these reserves to where they ought to be, and I'm adding up these reserves, and it adds up to $42 million.
That's correct.
And it's going to take us 3 to 5 years only, is what my reaction is, to build up $42 million in reserves.
And they're also not making a pilot during that period, or
That's correct.
franchise fees aren't being paid during that period?
So that's,
Hopefully, we'll not be paying the overdraft back.
Right.
well, no, that kicks it up to $50 million if you don't pay that overdraft back.
If you don't pay it back, you don't have to pay it.
Right, but as far as actual debt or,
You would get there quicker if you don't have to pay it back.
Yeah.
Be less.
right. We're painting this very bleak picture that's leading us to this conclusion that we need to put this ordinance in place or call a charter election or both, and yet, on the other hand, we're painting this picture that's going to get us to these huge amounts of reserves within 3 to 5 years. So that kind of, to me, begs the question, well then, if the anomaly in this whole scenario was in fact gas prices rising to the levels they did, and doing so unexpectedly, then, maybe it wasn't as bad as we thought, or it's not as horrific of a picture as we're painting.
Well, it's my understanding from talking to council about this that in March of 2003, the city was in a bad shape. Am I right or wrong on that?
Right. Correct.
So I don't know, Councilman.
I'd like to take a stab at that.
Well, before you do, Gary, let me kind of finish. And I don't think anybody on this dais is saying that we weren't.
Okay, that's fine.
And the question becomes, has this council taken steps since then to rectify that situation? And if so, how does this really help the situation? Well, it helps the situation because it ties council's hands in terms of ever looking to LPNL as a cash cow in the future.
That's correct.
And if that's the purpose, then maybe I can buy into it because it has been looked at that. But that also leads me to one of your reserves. You're calling it the Electric Utility Development Reserve.
That's 1 month expenses, $7 million.
Right, $7 million. Kind of reminds me of the old CIF, Community Improvement Fund.
I'm not familiar with that fund. I don't know what that
Well,
was.
that's the 1% off of all enterprise funds that went to funding Market Lubbock prior to the sales tax election.
Which then was...
We would have no connection with Market Lubbock with regard to our reserves.
Right, you're cutting out that step. But the ultimate purpose sounds very similar. Basically, an economic development tool is what it sounds like.
We use the word economic development, but what that really means is that a utility it's in business, okay, to do business. And so sometimes you're going to have to put infrastructure in to meet the needs of a growing city, which we are experiencing currently. And so we want some reserves set up. $7 million is not all that much money whenever you're talking about putting in an overhead line, Carol, right?
Well, and again, I'm not arguing with it. I'm just wanting to make sure we understand what it is.
That's right.
Because some folks will view that Electric Utility Development Reserve as the new cash cow. And
Not for the city.
And it becomes a question of because if you have to fund these other two reserves plus that one before you give a dividend, if you will, to the ultimate users, then it makes me wonder if you're ever going to get to the point of actually giving a dividend to the ultimate users, because that electric utility development reserve is going to be drawn down. And if your minimum is 7 million, you're going to have to build that up first.
That's correct.
So.
And that same application is to all those reserves. They need to stay firm.
There's one other factor there, Councilman, and that is that however that money was spent would have to be put in the budget, and the elected officials that sit on this city council would have to approve of that budget. So if they were just using it like market money, going over there, then this council, or the next council could just stop that and say, no, you can only use it for promotion or improvements of the electric utility, because the final authority is how the money is spent right here.
So, but if I understand your point correctly, Mr. Collier, you're basically saying all of these reserve accounts are going to have to be maintained at this level before we give a dividend. It's not just this last reserve account, it's all of them.
That's correct, sir.
So it's making it really, just to emphasize the point, it's really making me wonder if we're ever going to give a dividend, because I suspect we probably never will. Now, I will also tell you that
I disagree with that.
Well, hopefully you're right, and hopefully I'm wrong, but I guess time will tell. There is the last point is this. I mean, we're kind of talking about LP&L being the separate entity, but in fact, it's part of the city of Lubbock. And the question I've got is, if this ordinance is passed, and LP&L, for example, there's a huge gas spike again, or the purchase of wholesale gas just doesn't turn out to be the best decision, and we end up in the hole, I mean, ultimately, it's the city of Lubbock that's going to have to bail them out, because we are LP&L, and LP&L is us. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I appreciate the efforts that have been made in this regard, because I really do believe that we have gone away from the initial intent as when LP&L was created, and that is to provide the lowest rates possible. And I think we have gone to the point of treating it as a cash cow and treating it as an additional revenue source for the city of Lubbock, instead of making those hard political decisions such as lowering the property tax rate or increasing the property tax rate or cutting services or cutting personnel. And so this kind of cleans up the mess. The only concern I've got really on this deal is I think it should go to a charter election. And this strikes me as a way to kind of circumvent that charter election. And doesn't strike me as being a very clean way to go about doing it. That's the only concern I've got. The ultimate goal, I think, is a good one, but the way this is being done just doesn't strike me as, might be legal, let's put it that way, but it just doesn't strike me as being the cleanest way of going about doing it.
Passing the ordinance you're talking about?
Well, you're trying to incorporate some of the elements in the ordinance that really should only be incorporated through a charter change, is the way I'm viewing it. The direct chain of command, for example, is really the one that concerns me the most.
Well, that would be like saying what apparently councils have said for 32 years. Thanks for your work, and we know we have your report. We'll be back with you.
Yeah, no, I think calling the charter election takes it very much more to in the direction
I'd like
that
to respond, because Victor's raised some good, interesting points and interesting thoughts. Some I agree with, some I don't agree with. But we were outlined 3 ways by the city attorney's office of dealing with these issues of LP&L. LP&L is the department of the city. We can do it by charter, ordinance, and some state legislation statutes. That's what other cities in Texas have done.
Right.
We have chosen 2 out of the 3. One is ordinance. It's clean. It spells out exact terms where the board, where the city administration, where the city council's responsibilities are. Very clean. Then, with Councilman Martin's ideal to come with the added language and put it before the voters, very clean, very upfront, very clean. But I want to take it a few steps further. I want to talk about very quickly, the WTMPA, the gas contracts, and the taxes. On the WTMPA, I want to say this. I have been very hard, I have been very outspoken about city management in a lot of areas, but I want to talk about us as elected officials. We have a responsibility too. And I have always said on this particular issue, when I brought it up as to be looked at, is that it's like two wings on an airplane. You have the city management on one wing, the elected city council on the other wing. And with that in mind, how did we come up with WTMPA being a problem to begin with? It's because it took the time to get the financials, the audited financial statements, open the book, look at them and say, gee, this is in the red. Why is that? You know, it doesn't take a space-age scientist to see a red number. I've even suggested we color code our books down here so when we see red, we'll know what it means. If that helps. Green means we're making some money. You know, and when you open that up and you see that, then I would think any elected person would say, why is it red? How did it get this way? So we call a meeting with the external auditors, and that's when it began to unpeel the WTMPA. We found out what was going on. And then we set up the committee with Judge Warnick and John Wilkerson, Bob, and to look at these things. And then we come up with all these issues, and we have this off-balance sheet corporation that we own 95% of. But guess what? The bylaws have been rewritten to where even though we own 95%, we have hardly any say over the thing. Imagine that. You know, that's really a complex thought. You know, so that is what I call self-indulgence, shooting yourself in the foot, pretty much. We have a responsibility to read financial reports, to read audited reports. That's why the state government, when they passed what we're supposed to do, the tools to use to measure management, is your external audits and your audited financial statements and your management letters. In terms of the gas contracts, that is a precarious area that Victor alluded to, where you have purchase power or you generate your own power. And then it becomes a management decision that the city council will either sign on to or sign off of. Under the leadership of Mr. Carroll McDonald, you know, we sort of figured out that we're a little bitty utility company, a municipal utility company, and we can't compete with this conglomerate that can go out and generate gas with coal. We have to go purchase gas. They can use coal and gas and blend it, and they're worldwide, and they can lower their costs pretty much. It's going to be like me trying to be a little self-sustaining 7-Eleven to compete against United and say, you can get your potatoes cheaper at my store than you can at United. You know, it's a no-brainer. But I don't want to be too simplistic about it. And when you see, you need, I would imagine, a combination. We've gone from one extreme of generation to another extreme of purchasing power. And I guess at some points in times you have a balance that when you see the cost of gas coming down and you're working your books as management should, and you figure out that your cost to generate power is competitive, then you kick up the plants. You know, I don't want to be too simplistic about it, but it's once again having good management in place that knows what they're doing like Carroll knows. And then let's go to the taxes. Well, if we do away with this and don't treat LP&L as a cash cow, you know, we're not going to lower your taxes. Well, I don't ever remember being lower to begin with, and we had it the way it was. And plus, we're doing all this extra spending, and we're padding all these budgets on the enterprise funds with indirect cost, heavy overhead, which you folks pointed out. And this has been going on the last 6 years. It's been going on, I'm sure, a lot longer, but, you know, you highlight the last 6 years because you lost $22 million with transferring money out of our cash reserves to cover that. So I guess what we're looking at basically is status quo, and we know where that's been, versus do we change direction? Are we going to let history be our navigator? Are we going to learn from our mistakes? Are we going to learn that history can be our best teacher if we'll listen, or we're going to be bound to repeat history if we don't listen? So if I worry about, will I ever see a dividend check, or do I worry about Is my taxes going to go up because they went in the hole $35 million and somebody's got to bail us out? You know, I would rather entrust people committed to a entity that is free to get out there and compete and hire the kind of management team it needs to hire to compete, to keep rates low and pay Lubbock a dividend when it has met objectives that you'd ask for anyone to do. And no more smoke and mirrors, no more hidden transfers, no more coming in the back door through the alley and trying to make a big picture pretty when we know it's not. You know, so, you know, history is our guide. History is our navigator. And we need to learn to look to history. Thank you.
Well, and just to, and I appreciate the different perspective, Gary, because I think there is a different perspective. And that's why I thought it was important to give you the rest of the story, because there's at least 4 council members on this dais who have been part of that previous council syndrome, if you will. And the other thing is, I do want to clarify a couple of things. You know, there have been tax cuts prior to this council. And you might argue they weren't significant. You know, previous mayors, I think, would argue that they did push for and receive some tax cuts.
Okay.
The other point is, a lot of times we were told not so much that this would result in lowering your taxes, but it would result in maintaining the property tax rate at its current level or pretty close to it. So you can argue it back and forth all day long, and you're absolutely right. I mean, what we're doing is we're quarterbacking this on Monday morning, and I think you need to do that, and I think it's important for this council and councils to do that. But I think we need to also put it in perspective and say, well, where do we go from here? I certainly support calling a charter election. I don't have any problem with that. You know, I've got some concerns about this, though. That's the only issue I'm raising.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to get one little thing in if I could. On the proposed ordinance under Section 2-484, disbursement of net revenues, this is the section that outlines the reserve funds and when payment in lieu of taxes or franchises would be done and so forth. I'd like to propose adding a subsection E to that section, and the lawyers can lawyer this before 11:30. It's almost 11:30 now.
It takes 2 readings to pass.
I understand, but I would think that there needs to be some language added in the subsection E, that something to the effect that provisions of this section, meaning all of these outlined things in this ordinance, shall be memorialized in each fiscal year City of Lubbock budget ordinance. The mother's milk, the way you do the dirty deed of getting stuff done and going through the back door is the budget ordinance, and that we found this council has been very cognitive of the budget ordinance each year when the budget is adopted. And that's where you give written instructions to management that these are the ways that you will operate. And it's great to have this ordinance, and I'm all in favor of it, but we need to put a section in there that says that these provisions also are memorialized, meaning they're reworded or however, but they're put into that budget ordinance. So when bond rating agencies, department heads, city managers, staffs, anybody picks up that budget ordinance, that is the law of the land, and we're going to maintain these reserve funds, and this is how we're going to do it. And I believe that language needs to be done.
Okay.
Sunset? No, not sunset. I don't want to sunset these things, but I do want to make sure that we have them in there. For example, one of the things that if the council recalls that we did in the budget ordinance the year before last was we put some limits on the authority of the city manager to approve contracts. It was almost an unlimited authority at the time. And if you'll recall, 2 years ago, the budget ordinance basically said, in so many words, once the council adopts the budget, the city manager can do anything with it he wants to, and it's pre-approved. Almost sounds like one of those credit card offers you get in the mail 20 times a day that says you're pre-approved.
Councilman Martin, I just wish we'd have thought of that.
So I would suggest, Mayor, that we would want to amend that and add that in there.
Also on section 2-480, under members qualifications, I'm looking down through there. It talks in there about must be eligible voters, City of Lubbock, must continue to reside, be eligible to vote. Should we put something in there that board members should be a customer of LP&L and not a customer of LP&L's competition to be on this board? Should that be a requirement as well?
And also, we do have a majority of my council district is not even in LP&L service territory. And we may want to consider, too, that someone would at least live or be a customer in the service territory.
Do what?
If you don't have a choice, some people that live in some places don't have that option.
You might have to say something if it's available to them.
If they reside within the LP&L
Trade territory.
trade.
Can you work on that, Matt?
The co-op
Right.
has exclusive areas.
Right, that's
Yeah,
what I
I'm
just
with
said.
Yeah.
That's what I just said.
Yeah.
We got you.
Yeah.
Detail, are you co-op?
No, but I said about 60% of my district is in the co-op.
Right.
Actually, a minority of my council district is in LP&L service territory.
Tom and I do not have competition where we live. Do what?
There's no competition with the co-op.
Well, there's no competition where Tom and I live either. We're in the
We're in
LP&L
exclusive LP&L territory.
Okay, does anybody else have a question? WR, thank y'all very much.
Thank you for
But it's
listening
ironic,
to
it's
us.
gone from a committee to a commission.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does that mean the pay's better?
Judge Warnick had hair back when he first started doing this.
That's why I don't have it, is all this.
Thank y'all for being here. Okay, do what?
No.
Yeah. All right, next we have item 6C, presentation by Lubbock Sports Authority regarding an increase in this entire
So
pay.
moved.
Thank you. Have a motion, is there a second? This is on the electric utility that we've been discussing for 2 hours this
This was
morning.
the item that we had in work session, right, Mayor?
Mayor, I've got some language to amend that ordinance that we're going to be approving on first reading.
I don't have a second, so motion.
Now you do.
I do.
I would offer the following amendment. Under section 2-480, members and qualifications, subsection C, that be amended to include, at the end of that sentence, and shall be customers of the city's electric utility, provided that service with the city's electric utility is available. Also, let's see here, on section 2-484, disbursement of net revenues, that the following sentence be inserted at the beginning of the paragraph, subsection A. City shall not require the city's electric utility to reimburse any other fund of the city for monies or funds charged or assessed to the city's electric utility which were incurred on or prior to February 5, 2004, unless otherwise required by law, period. Furthermore, or insert then, furthermore, prior to paying any fee, et cetera. And I would say parenthetically, that just so that we know what the intent is, if we ever have to go back and look, Becky, that the intent of that is to write off that receivable from LP&L to the city.
Was that your only modifications?
Nope, there's one more.
Okay, excuse me.
And the last is under that same section, section 2-484, disbursement of net revenues, under subsection, or to add subsection E, and that will include, this section shall be included in and become a part of each annual budget of the city of Lubbock. And I'd offer those as amendments to.
Mayor, I accept those amendments.
Second.
Okay, I just have one question. Ms. Burgess, the way that E is written there, does that mean it's in the budget ordinance, or does it just mean it's in that budget book that nobody reads?
We need to be budget ordinance. It needs to be in the budget ordinance, so
if you want additional language there, we could add some.
After budget, put an ordinance and just read each annual budget ordinance of the city of Lubbock.
And I would accept that.
I would
Second.
also.
Okay. Anybody else have something to add?
Now, I've got a question, though, just to make sure. You're talking about basically not recovering that overdraft that was, that term was used earlier today?
That's right.
And that overdraft is approximately $7 million?
A little less than that now, I think, but yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the question I've got is more to Beverly, I guess. As LPNL has been paying this off over the last some few months and gotten it down to less than 7 or thereabouts, has any of that monies, or have any of the monies that we were anticipating to receive in the future, were they built in at all into our budget?
No, the overdraft is not built into the budget.
Not at all, so
But
as far as this
obviously on
upcoming
your
budget-
balance sheet, because I mean, you're talking about an income statement issue, the budget, versus the balance sheet. The balance sheet is where we carried the IOU, for lack of a better term. So basically, you would forgive, just like the golf fund. Earlier, we made a comparison to the golf fund. It would be a balance sheet adjustment.
It all goes away on consolidation.
Right. Now, the reason, though, I kind of differentiate this between the golf fund and this is because in the golf fund, there really was never any expectation of receiving those monies back, whereas here, based on the information provided to this council, I think we could say that there could be an expectation to receive that money in the future.
Yes, I think that up until this point, that expectation was that that IOU would be repaid over time. There was never a timetable established.
Correct.
Yes.
Well, and I'm saying that in light of the fact that Carol was saying it's going to take 3 to 5 years to build up our reserves. Well, if that's the case, then it could have been used to pay this money back.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure on that. But there is no impact on the budget.
Not on the budget. Like I said, this is a balance sheet item. What it will do is it will reduce the working capital available in the general fund. And so that'll be a discussion that, as the audit comes to the end, they're going to have, the auditors are probably going to have a concern as far as working capital reserves on the general fund. But I think
I would reiterate what I said when we had this discussion about the golf course. That's working capital that we owe ourselves.
that's true. That's absolutely
It goes
true.
away on consolidation. When all these accounts are consolidated, it goes away anyway.
That's right.
It's funny money.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we will have a discussion with the auditors on that. I mean, they need to be fully aware. This is something that's happened subsequent to the close of our financials, and we haven't issued the audit yet, so we will be, discussing this.
That's what the voters hired Mr. Gilbreth for, is to deal with them. He speaks that lingo and
Right.
knows how to deal with it.
And so, just one last question, and I understand how Councilman Gilbreth is viewing this, but as funny money, but also, is it going to have any impact at all on our bond rating?
I can't,
It ought to improve it.
I
It ought
can't
to
look forward to see it. It could, it
It ought
could
to
not.
help.
I think that's just going to, on one hand, I mean, I think the rating agencies will look that, you're cleaning up the LP&L side.
Right.
That you're making conscious decisions, they are very considered, so I think that's positive. The fact that it reduces your working capital, officially, instead, they're going to consider all that, but I think that there's both sides of the scale there.
Okay.
Beverly, is there a requirement on the level of funds in the working capital?
We have targets.
Fund.
I wouldn't call it a requirement. We have targets.
What's
And,
that target?
For the general fund, I believe it's 45 days, 60 days.
Okay, what is it today?
Today, we're right at that requirement or that target. So if we fall below that, I think when we have a plan to reestablish LP&L reserves, we have a plan to reestablish general fund reserves, you have targets, and there's reasons you get below those targets.
Well, is taking this action of wiping the dollars off the paper that don't exist anyway, is that going to have an effect on the bottom line of that working capital fund?
Yes, the general fund working capital is based on balance sheet items, and so it's going to fall below that threshold.
It'll be reduced below that 45-day level.
That's correct, because receivables are considered in that working capital. It's not a pure cash And so the receivable that's booked to and from ourselves,
Your working
albeit-
capital is your current assets less your
That's
current
right.
liabilities, and it'd be just, what you're saying is it'd be the same thing as if, in order to pad my balance sheet, my personal balance sheet, I told I borrowed some money, my wife borrowed some money from me. That's what it amounts to. And when WR gets ready to loan us money, that's going to all go away on consolidation. Same thing applies here.
Okay, that's what I want
It's
to know.
funny money.
I think it's prudent. I think y'all have exercised prudence in discussing it and considering it. It's not, a rushed or, snap decision. So I think that there's justification, and that's what the rating agencies are going to do.
It's just like the golf fund. We're cleaning up our books so that we're not shuffling money around and giving someone who looks at us from the outside a reason to say, well, why are you doing this? Or why are you doing that? It's cleaning everything up so that it looks straight.
Yes.
Is this the last thing that needs to be cleaned up? Last account?
I mean, I'm not going to tell you there's not some little things out there. I mean,
And you'll be bringing
every
those back
day,
to us?
make
We have lots of
corrections.
opportunities, Victor, in the days ahead.
So these are the biggest things that we have out there, absolutely.
Okay.
But today I sigh of relief.
Yes.
The only other question, Mr. Mayor, is, and maybe I didn't catch it, is the election or calling for the election for the charter amendment in May of this year?
It's not a part of this
It's
motion.
not part of this, and it's going to require a special council meeting?
It will if we can do that, but it looks at this point like we will not be able to call a special election based on an assumption, correct?
I have received preliminary information that having contingency language on the ballot is problematic. We will continue to look at that and bring information back to you finally as we get to a final determination.
Mayor, it just seems...
We'd have to do that before the 15th.
It just seems to me that it's incumbent on all of those on this council who wish to stay on this council to get reelected so we can make sure that what we're doing today stays in effect until we can have that charter election.
That's true. All right, any other discussion? We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 7-0.
Mayor, I would request that maybe you instruct staff to post haste, get to work with bond counsel to figure out what we do about dependency of a charter election.
Okay, we will. WR, Judge, we appreciate y'all's service on the committee, and reserving, letting y'all go and telling you your work has been complete. We may reserve that right until we find out about the bond election later this week. Is that okay?
You're still available, right?
We've got some work up on what to do.
Right. Well, if we're going to do that, we would like your input on that, so if you would allow us to call on you if it looks like we could do that? Okay.
But we do appreciate what you all did.
Thanks for your work.
There's 30 years right there. Who says government doesn't move quick?
So, Nate, if you'll just get back with me on that, and we can decide how to move forward. Okay. Item number 34B has been pulled, correct?
Mr. Mayor, I ask that be pulled. There is a movement afoot to raise those monies privately.